Experience. Is it not rather what we expect in men, that they should have numerous strands of experience lying side by side and never compare them with each other? George Eliot. Spontaneous human experiences provide the core motivation for studying psychic phenomena. While there is always some distortion and exaggeration when recalling unusual incidents, sufficient similarity appears in reports from different people, in tens of thousands of case studies around the world, to form basic categories for the phenomena. The scientific challenge is to take these raw experiences and try to figure out what they mean. Are they what they appear to be, genuine phenomena that transcend the usual boundaries of space and time, or are they better understood as conventional psychological and physical effects? To provide an experiential base for the experiments discussed later, here are some examples of commonly reported human experiences. Feeling at a distance. The prototypical case of feeling at a distance, published by author Bernard Gittelsson, concerns an event reported by the 19th-century landscape painter Arthur Severn and his wife, Joan. According to Mrs. Severn, I woke up with a start, feeling I had had a hard blow on my mouth, and with a distinct sense that I had been cut and was bleeding under my upper lip, and seized my pocket handkerchief and held it in a little pushed lump to the part, as I sat up in bed, and after a few seconds, when I removed it, I was astonished not to see any blood, and only then realized it was impossible anything could have struck me there, as I lay fast asleep in bed, and so I thought it was only a dream, but I looked at my watch, and saw it was 7, and finding Arthur my husband was not in the room, I concluded rightly that he must have gone out on the lake for an early sail, as it was so fine. I then fell asleep. At breakfast 9:30 Arthur came in rather late, and I noticed he rather purposely sat further away from me than usual, and every now and then put his pocket handkerchief furtively up to his lip, in the very way I had done. I said, "Arthur, why are you doing that?" and added a little anxiously, "I know you have hurt yourself. But I'll tell you why afterwards." He said, "Well, when I was sailing, a sudden squall came, throwing the tiller suddenly round, and it struck me a bad blow in the mouth, under the upper lip, and it has been bleeding a good deal and won't stop." I said then, "Have you any idea what o'clock it was when it happened?" And he answered, "It must have been about 7. I then told what had happened to me, much to his surprise, and all who were with us at breakfast. In a modern version of the same type of experience, Fred, an executive in a high-technology company, recounted the following story. In the middle of the night, out of a deep sleep, Fred suddenly jerked upright into a sitting position. He clutched his chest, gasping for breath. His wife, abruptly awakened by her husband's sudden movement, anxiously asked, "What's wrong?" A few moments later, when Fred was able to breathe normally again, he told his wife that he was all right, but he had a feeling that something terrible had happened. They glanced at the clock, 2:05 a.m. 15 minutes later, as they settled back to sleep, the phone rang. Fred's father was on the line. "I have bad news," he said. "Your mother just had a heart attack. We were sleeping, when she suddenly sat bolt upright, clutched her chest, and she passed away." Fred was shocked. "When did this happen?" he asked. "About 15 minutes ago, just after 2 a.m., replied his father. Is it really possible to feel someone else's experience at a distance? Is there evidence for genuine telepathy, where all normal sensory cues have been eliminated and we know that the experience was not exaggerated or misremembered? We will see later that the answer is yes. At least some cases of telepathy do include the perception of feelings and possibly the experiences of another person. Seeing at a distance. Like many spontaneous psychic experiences, clairvoyance is often associated with dangerous situations, life crises, and other moments of high need or motivation. For example, Beverly Nichols, a reporter for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, tells of an incident in 1963, when he was in England, describing a procession of Queen Elizabeth in her royal coach. "Without any warning, I had a sharp feeling of discomfort, almost of nausea, accompanied by an acute headache. The picture of the Queen and her cavalcade vanished as swiftly as if it had been blacked out in a theatrical performance, to be replaced by an equally vivid picture of President Kennedy driving in an open car, flanked by his escort of motorcyclists with their snarling exhausts. And as though it were being dictated to me, I began to describe the scene. When the procession was over a few minutes later, Nichols was leaving for a drink when a stranger rushed up to him and said, 'President Kennedy has been assassinated 6 minutes ago.' The next example is more mundane, except for the fact that it was part of a government program funded in 1974 at Stanford Research Institute, a Menlo Park, California, think tank. The Central Intelligence Agency wanted to know if clairvoyance could be used to see distant, strategically important locations. The narrator of this tale is physicist Russell Targ, who used an experimental method with a remote viewer named Pat Price, a retired police commissioner from Burbank, California. Price was given only longitude and latitude coordinates of an unknown site somewhere on the other side of the world, and was asked to describe what he saw there. On July 10 of 1974, one of our contract monitors came to Stanford Research Institute with a new task for us to do. This contract monitor, a physicist from the CIA, had brought us coordinates from what he described as a Soviet site of great interest to the analysts. They wanted any information we could give them, and they were eager to find out if we could describe a target 10,000 miles away, with only coordinates to work from. Armed with a slip of paper bearing the coordinates, Price and I climbed to the second floor of Stanford Research Institute's radio physics building and locked ourselves into a small electrically shielded room which we had been using for our experiments. As always, I began our little ritual of starting the tape recorder, giving the time and date, and describing who we were and what we were doing. I then read the coordinates. As was Pat's custom, he polished his spectacles, leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He was silent for about a minute, then began his description. I am lying on my back on the roof of a 2 or 3-story brick building. It's a sunny day. The sun feels good. There's the most amazing thing. There's a giant gantry crane moving back and forth over my head. As I drift up in the air and look down, it seems to be riding on a track with one rail on each side of the building. I've never seen anything like that. Pat then made a little sketch of the layout of the buildings and the crane, which he labeled as a gantry. Later on, he again drew the crane. After several days we completed the remote viewing. We were astonished when we were told later that the site was the super-secret Soviet atomic bomb laboratory at Semipalatinsk, where they were also testing particle beam weapons. The accuracy of Price's drawing is the sort of thing that I, as a physicist, would never have believed, if I had not seen it for myself. The drawing was made by the CIA from satellite photography of the Semipalatinsk. This was a remarkably accurate case, one of hundreds of experiments conducted by the Stanford Research Institute researchers. But is there any reason to believe that clairvoyance is a genuine ability that most people can use if they put their mind to it? After 110 years of experimental research, the answer is clear. Yes, it appears that various forms of extended perception are authentic and are probably distributed among the general population like any other talent, such as musical or sports ability. Mind over matter. I can't work there, screamed Gail. She had just returned from her first day as a psychiatric nurse in the lockup ward of a state mental hospital for the criminally insane. A sensitive, emotionally expressive woman, Gail was in shock after trying to cope all day with psychotic patients on a dangerous ward. She kept repeating that she couldn't work there. Because she was so upset, her roommate, Dan, suggested that she try something she found relaxing, like sewing. Gail reluctantly agreed and turned on the machine. A few seconds later, a foot-long blue flame shot out of the control switch and the sewing machine abruptly died. Gail jumped up angrily, saying, "This doesn't work." She stomped over to the stove to heat up a teapot. She turned the knob and nothing happened. The gas oven was completely silent. There was no snapping sound of the electric pilot light, no hissing sound of gas, nothing. Still wanting some tea, Gail put a mug of water in the microwave oven, set the timer, and hit the start button. Nothing happened. The oven was dead. As Dan went over to examine the microwave oven, Gail stormed out of the kitchen, muttering angrily how nothing seemed to work anymore. She started her tape recorder in the living room. A few seconds later she shrieked, "What the?" Dan ran into the living room just in time to see the cassette player chewing up tape and spitting it out onto the floor. By now Gail was becoming skittish about touching anything. Dan tried to calm her by saying, "Don't be silly, these are coincidences. Play a record instead." She put a record on the turntable and turned it on. It started to move, then they both heard a loud snap and the turntable stopped dead. Gail said angrily, "See, it doesn't work." At this point, Dan suggested that perhaps she should just go to bed, as he couldn't afford any more repair bills even if the strange events were just coincidences. No, and quit her exceedingly stressful job. In the meantime, Dan had procrastinated about getting the appliances repaired, and when things settled down, he tried them all again to confirm that they were broken. Sure enough, the sewing machine, turntable, and cassette recorder were still quite dead, and when Dan opened them up, he found that several of the electrical components had been fused inside each of the appliances. But to his amazement, the gas and the microwave ovens worked perfectly. There was no sign that anything had ever been wrong with them. Is there any reason to believe that psychokinesis, perhaps amplified by high anxiety or stress, may affect the behavior of machines, actually causing them to fail? The answer is yes. Psychokinesis may be responsible for the failure of some machines, especially sensitive electronic machines. Later, we'll discuss how more than 70 researchers around the world have been studying mind-matter interactions in the laboratory for more than 50 years. Intuitive hunches. You are driving down a nearly deserted highway on a dry, clear day. A single car ahead of you is going a little slower than you like to drive, so you check your rearview mirror and prepare to pass. As you start to accelerate, you inexplicably get a bad feeling, so you immediately take your foot off the accelerator. As soon as your foot leaves the accelerator, the car in front of you suddenly swerves into the passing lane without warning, its front tire having just blown out. If you had continued to accelerate, you would have been in a serious, high-speed accident. Was the bad feeling that saved you merely a coincidence, or was it something more? Intuition may be thought of as being aware of something without knowing how you are aware of it. Oftentimes, an intuitive feeling is an educated guess, a combination of past experience and astute judgment. In this sense, intuition may be thought of as the mental analog of a gymnast's well-trained body. With talent and training, the mind and the body can both do exceptionally difficult maneuvers on their own, without conscious direction. In the case of the car driving example, perhaps you unconsciously observed a slight wobble in the car ahead of you. This might have presaged a tire blowout, which filtered its way to your conscious mind as a caution, and this is what caused the bad feeling. But there are some intuitive hunches that cannot be explained so easily. For example, a colleague named Alex recalled the following dramatic experience. Preparing for a hunting trip later in the month, Alex was cleaning a double-action, 6-shot revolver. For safety's sake, he normally kept 5 bullets in the revolver, with the hammer resting on the 6th, empty chamber. He carefully removed the 5 bullets, cleaned the gun thoroughly, then began to put the bullets back in the pistol. When he arrived at the 5th and final bullet, he unexpectedly got a bad feeling, a distinct sense of dread that had something to do with that bullet. Alex worried about this odd feeling, because nothing like it had ever happened to him before. He decided to trust his intuition, so he put the bullet aside and positioned the pistol's hammer as usual over the 6th chamber. The chamber next to it, which normally held the 5th bullet, now was also empty. 2 weeks later, Alex was at the hunting lodge with his fiancée and her parents. That evening, an ugly argument broke out between the parents over their impending divorce. Alex tried to calm them down, but the father, in a violent rage, grabbed Alex's gun, which was in a drawer, and pointed it at his wife. Alex tried to stop the impending disaster by jumping between the gun and the woman, but he was too late, the trigger had already been pulled. For a horrifying split second, Alex knew that he was about to get shot at point-blank range. But instead of a sudden, blazing death, the pistol went, click. The cylinder had revolved to an empty chamber, the very chamber that would have contained the 5th bullet if Alex had not set it aside 2 weeks before point 8. In his case, Alex's intuition saved his life. To this day, he keeps that 5th bullet in a safe deposit box because, as he puts it, it's said that everyone has one bullet with their name on it. I'm one of the few who knows exactly where that bullet is, and I'm never letting it out of my possession. Alex's hunch cannot be attributed to unconscious sensory information, or even to an educated guess, because the details, exact timing, and even the people involved in Alex's hunting trip were not known when he was cleaning his gun. And he had never been involved in such a deadly altercation before, or since. So where did the bad feeling come from? One possibility is that the information comes from our own future experience. We call such time-displaced perceptions precognition, for pre-knowledge of the future, or presentiment, for pre-feeling. While precognitions are fairly common experiences, especially in the form of intuitive hunches and dreams, many scientists consider true precognition to be impossible, mainly because it suggests that causation is not as simple as we thought. It raises the perplexing possibility that causation sometimes flows backward. This is deeply troubling to some scientists because most scientific models assume that cause and effect flow in only one direction. Despite the disquieting implications, the results of a half-century of experimental tests, described later, indicate that some forms of precognition do exist. The feeling of being stared at. A commonly reported form of distant mental influence on living organisms is the feeling of being stared at, which is closely related historically to the notion of the evil eye. Considerable folklore endorses the idea that gazing at someone carries special powers, favors, or influence. Folklore aside, contemporary opinion polls consistently confirm that the feeling of being stared at is known in all cultures. The classic episode is as follows. A woman is having lunch alone at a diner when she slowly starts to feel agitated. She initially thinks it may be the caffeine from one too many cups of coffee, but the hair on the back of her neck is beginning to tingle uncomfortably. Soon she just can't shake the creepy feeling that someone is watching her. She gets the sense that the someone is behind her, so she turns to look, and sure enough, an intense young man is staring directly at her. A similar tale is described in this paragraph from a short story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. At breakfast this morning I suddenly had that vague feeling of uneasiness which comes over some people when closely stared at, and, quickly looking up, I met his eyes bent upon me with an intensity which amounted to ferocity, though their expression instantly softened as he made some conventional remark upon the weather. Can a starer's intense focus affect the human nervous system? As with the study of intuition, to answer this we first have to ensure that the starry cannot be cued through normal sensory means, or through any form of unconscious information that might have alerted the starry to the presence of the starer. The feeling of being stared at has been studied in the laboratory for nearly a century. In the most recent versions of these experiments, the starer and starry are isolated from each other, and the starer watches the starry over closed-circuit video to maintain strict sensory separation. Results of such experiments, discussed later, reveal that focusing on another person from a distance does in fact affect the nervous system of the stared-at person. People in laboratory tests are rarely consciously aware of these physiological changes, suggesting that we may be influenced by others far more than we know. Distant mental healing. A related topic is prayer, spiritual healing, or any form of what might be called distant mental healing. In a prototype case, a friend is scheduled for exploratory surgery the next morning to remove a tumor. She asks you to pray for her fast recovery. You pray intensely that night, and the next morning you receive a phone call from her. She reports that the preparatory X-rays show that the tumor has disappeared. After it is confirmed that no trace remains of the tumor that was there the day before, the surgery is cancelled, much to the consternation of the doctors and the amazement of your friend. Were your prayers answered? Author Bernard Gidelson reports the following similar story. Physician Rex Gardner of Sunderland District Hospital in Britain has investigated several inexplicable cases of apparent healing through prayer. In one, a woman asked the parishioners of her church to pray for her recovery from a severely ulcerous varicose condition in her leg. Her doctor had told her that even if she were healed, the scar would require skin grafting, but the ulcer healed completely the day after the prayer meeting, and no grafting was required. In his report, Gardner says that the story is so bizarre that I would not have included it had I not been one of the doctors who examined the patient's leg at the next monthly prayer meeting and had all the people who had been present not been available for interrogation. 10. More generally, is there any evidence that thinking about people at a distance, directing either calm, loving thoughts or aggressive, malevolent thoughts, actually affects their physiology? 4 decades of laboratory experiments, discussed later, reveal that the answer is quite clearly yes. When a billion minds think alike. Substantial laboratory evidence suggests that when a mind directs its focus toward a distant object, that object will change its behavior. Given this, the question naturally arises as to whether the effects caused by one person in the laboratory may scale up to include real-world events involving millions or billions of people. In a series of recent studies with extraordinary implications, our laboratory, along with colleagues at Princeton University, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, has begun to examine this question. The results indicate that when many minds think alike, the state of the world does indeed change. For example, on October 3, 1995, at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, a remarkable incident took place. A sizable fraction of the globe's population, perhaps a billion minds, paid rapt attention to a single event, the announcement of the verdict in the murder trial of former football star O.J. Simpson. Our research suggests that when groups of people concentrate on a single event, this mental focusing actually affects the physical world in unexpected ways. Later, we discuss how we went about studying field consciousness effects during the O.J. Simpson verdict, the broadcasts of the 1995 and 1996 Academy Awards, and the opening ceremonies of the Centennial Olympic Games. We also discuss independent replications of these surprising mass mind effects by colleagues at other universities. Psi in the world at large. Compounding evidence suggesting that psi events occur in the world at large immediately raises the question of whether psi also occurs in casinos. Presumably, most of the people playing casino games want to win. Their wishes directed toward the games closely resemble the mental intentions studied in laboratory-based psi experiments. While casinos always win in the long run because the odds are stacked in favor of the house, on rare days they can lose money if several big slot machine jackpots, or big wins on the table games, are hit on the same day. Do casino profits fluctuate in predictable ways? Are some people luckier than usual on certain days because the University of Nevada, Las Vegas is within a mile of the highest density of casinos in the world? Through personal contacts, our laboratory obtained the unusual opportunity to examine the daily win-loss ratios for both table games and slot machines in a casino. We found evidence of predictable variations in casino profits that are also related to factors associated with psi ability. This suggests that psi does indeed manifest in casinos. Later, we'll discuss what we found, along with corroborating findings about possible psi-mediated fluctuations in the payout rates of state and national lottery games. Limitations of stories. While the anecdotes in this chapter and the following chapters are intriguing, as stories they are not sufficiently persuasive to convince most scientists that psi is real. But what about 100 similar stories? Or 1,000? Surely tens of thousands of such stories would cause one to pause and seriously wonder if psi is real. Still, because psychologists have shown that memory is much more fallible than most people think, and because eyewitness testimony is easily distorted, simply collecting more anecdotal stories will not settle the scientific question about psychic. To do this, we need to consider two topics in some detail: what counts as scientific evidence? And how do we measure this evidence? Let's begin with the concept of replication.